Here's what nobody tells you about a trap. The best ones don't look like traps. They look like opportunities. They look like your ship finally coming in. They look like the bank loan officer driving out to your farm in a brand new truck, sitting down at your kitchen table, and telling you that all that idle equity in your land is a sin, that you owe it to your family to borrow against it, that the smart money was already moving, and you needed to decide which side of smart you wanted to be on. This is a story about what happened to the men who believed him, and about one man who didn't. It started with wheat. In 1972, the Soviet Union made a quiet deal with the United States government. Moscow needed grain. America had it. And almost overnight, that transaction rewrote the psychology of every farmer from Dodge City to the Nebraska Panhandle. Export tonnage tripled. Prices climbed so fast that men who had farmed modestly their entire lives suddenly felt something new in their chests. That particular inflation of the self that money makes possible. Land prices followed. A quarter section outside liberal Kansas that had sold for $180 an acre in 1968 was selling for $900 by 1976. Men looked at those numbers and did the math they wanted to do. If it kept climbing to $1,200, to $1,500, to $2,000, then the land itself was the investment. The crops were almost beside the point. Banks were not just willing to lend. They were pushing loans across kitchen tables like they were doing farmers a favor. Enter Harlon Vaoth. Harlon ran the implement dealership in Meade, Kansas, and he understood better than almost anyone how to turn a man's ambition into a sale. He had a way of talking. Smooth, certain, the kind of voice that made doubt feel like weakness. In the boom years, he put a $78,000 four-wheel drive articulated tractor on a flatbed and drove it farm to farm as a demonstration. Men climbed up into that cab and felt the future under their hands. Harlon made the financing sound simple. The monthly payments were just a number. Numbers were manageable when land was going up 12% a year. He sold 180 tractors in those years. He wore a Rolex. He believed what he was selling. That's important. Harlon wasn't a con man. He was a believer, and that made him more dangerous than any con man could be. Families who had farmed 640 acres bought another section. Families who farmed a section bought two. New irrigation equipment went in across the Ogallala Aquifer. New grain bins rose beside old ones. New debt layered over old debt, year after year, like sediment building up on a river bottom. Nobody saw the riverbank cracking. What broke it came from two directions at once, and the timing was almost surgical in its cruelty. In October 1979, the Federal Reserve Chairman announced he would use interest rates as a weapon against inflation. He meant it in a way that nobody fully believed until the rates arrived. The prime rate climbed to 21.5% by June of 1981. Variable rate farm loans, which most of the new debt was, repriced with it. Men who had borrowed $400,000 at 9% suddenly owed $84,000 a year in interest alone, against crops that were already weakening. Then the grain embargo hit. The export market that had started the whole fire was shut off just like that. Wheat prices collapsed. Corn followed, and land values, the floor under all of it, the thing men had counted on, fell, not slowly, in lurches. Each foreclosure dragged the price lower. Each courthouse auction made the next one worse. By 1984, the plains were in open crisis. Farm foreclosures ran at rates not seen since the 1930s. Nearly 300 agricultural banks failed inside 2 years. Farm auctions became a ritual of grief. Neighbors showed up. Sometimes to bid, sometimes just to stand there, bearing witness to a life being sold off in pieces. The county mental health crisis lines knew what was happening, even when nobody else was reporting it. The Kansas State line for farm families took more calls in the winter of 1985 than in the previous 5 years combined. Men who had done everything they were told to do, borrowed, expanded, leveraged, grown, sat in their pickups at the edges of fields they no longer owned and didn't come home. 110 of Harlon Vaoth's 180 customers lost their farms. Harlon kept the Rolex. For now, somewhere in the middle of all of this, invisible to anyone paying attention to the crisis, which was everyone, a quiet man named Reuben Kloss was watching. He was 38 years old, lean, unhurried, the kind of man who could sit in silence long enough that you forgot he was there, and then say one sentence that you'd think about for a week. He had inherited 320 acres of dryland wheat ground from his father. No irrigation, no new machinery, no debt. His father, Ewald, had farmed the same ground the same careful way for 30 years and had died in 1979, owing nothing to anyone. When the loan officers had come to Ewald's table, he had listened, nodded politely, and declined. Not out of fear, out of understanding. He knew what borrowed money required of you. It required that you serve it instead of yourself. Reuben had watched his father do this his entire childhood. He had absorbed it so completely he barely knew he had it. Which is why, in the spring of 1984, when 40 acres of the most scorned ground in Meade County went to auction, and nobody in that crowd would lift a hand, Reuben Klaas raised his. The bid was $140 an acre. The crowd laughed. That 40 acres of limestone and cedar brush and thin, broken soil would become the most important decision any farmer in that county made in a generation. But nobody knew that yet. The crow calling from the cedars wasn't talking. You want to know what separates the man who survives from the man who doesn't? It's not intelligence. It's not luck. It's not even hard work, because the men who lost everything in those years worked as hard as anyone alive. What separates them is simpler and harder than any of that. It's what you saw fail. Ewald Klaas had farmed 320 acres of dry land wheat ground outside Meade his entire adult life. He never irrigated. He never bought a machine he couldn't pay for in cash. When neighbors upgraded, Ewald welded. When loan officers came calling with their easy smiles and their talk of idle equity, he thanked them for the drive out and walked them back to their trucks. People in town thought he was stubborn. A few thought he was simple. Ewald didn't mind either one. He wasn't afraid of debt because he'd been burned by it. He hadn't. He avoided it the way a man avoids a particular stretch of road after he's seen what happens to the people who take it. Quietly, without drama, without needing to explain himself to anyone. He died in 1979. The farm passed to Reuben clear. 320 acres, no liens, an old case tractor with more welds than original metal, 3 grain bins, and a way of seeing the world that Reuben had absorbed so slowly and so completely, it felt like his own. It was his own. That was the point. Reuben was not a man who talked about what he was going to do. He was a man who did it, and let you notice or not. So when he drove home from the Schoenfeld auction in the spring of 1984 with 40 acres of dead ground in his name and $5,600 less in his savings account, the price of a used pickup, nothing more. He didn't stop at the co-op to explain himself. He didn't call his cousin. He turned down the gravel road toward his place and listened to the radio without hearing it, thinking about soil, not what the soil was, what it had been. And whether the distance between those two things could be crossed. The auction crowd had already moved on. The story, such as it was, belonged to Harlon Vaoth. Harlon had been holding court near the seed display at the Farmers Co-op elevator when the news arrived, and he made the most of it. He shook his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who considers himself a realist. He said that Reuben had always been his daddy's boy, that Ewald had spent his whole life saving every penny and spending it on nothing, and now the son had gone and bought 40 acres of nothing to prove the tradition wasn't dead. The men around him laughed. It was 1984, and laughter was something to hold on to. Harlon was still wearing the Rolex. His dealership was still open, barely, sustained by service work on the very tractors he'd sold on terms that were now crushing the men who owned them. He did not yet understand what was coming for him. He was still the man in the room who knew things. Reuben heard about the co-op performance a week later from his cousin, who thought he deserved to know. Reuben listened, nodded once, and said nothing. That was the whole of his response. He drove out to the 40 acres in early May and walked every foot of it. It took 3 hours. He didn't bring anything to write on. He just walked it the way his father had taught him to walk ground, slowly, looking down more than forward, reading what the soil was trying to tell you if you were quiet enough to hear it. What he saw was not a dead place. It was a wounded one. There's a difference, and the difference matters more than almost anything else in this story. Dead means finished. Wounded means there's still something alive in there, trying. The thin topsoil, the cedar trees drinking the groundwater, the erosion channels cutting through the draws. None of that was permanent. It was damage. Damage can be undone if you're willing to go slow enough and humble enough to let the ground do most of the work itself. Reuben understood this in the way that men who grow up watching their fathers farm understand things, not from a textbook, but from years of quiet observation that you don't even know is education until you need it. He spent the summer clearing cedar. No hired equipment, no borrowed money. A chainsaw, his boots, and his own time. He worked from the highest point down, methodically, the way you solve any large problem, one piece at a time. No rushing, no shortcuts. The cedars had been shading out every chance the native grass had to return. Removing them wasn't farming. It was more like clearing the way so something already trying to live could finally try. The following spring, he seeded the slopes. Side oats grama, buffalo grass, hairy vetch, Austrian winter peas. He contoured the worst erosion channels by hand, stacking flat limestone slabs across the draws to slow the water down and give the soil somewhere to settle instead of washing away. Then he asked nothing of the ground. Not that year, not the year after. He waited. The county didn't notice. The county was occupied with its own emergency. Banks failing in Liberal and Sublet. Another wave of foreclosures. Farm credit offices swamped with men who had no way out of the numbers they'd signed their names to. A quiet farmer seeding clover on 40 acres of scrubland was not a story anyone was tracking. Which meant Reuben worked in peace. And peace, for a man trying to rebuild something broken, is its own kind of advantage. He dug test holes each spring, his father's habit, the way a good doctor takes a pulse before assuming health. In 1984, his shovel hit clay and caliche almost immediately. The soil that came up was gray, compacted, lifeless. He measured the organic matter with a kit from the extension office and wrote the number in a spiral notebook, 0.8%. He measured the topsoil depth at 3 reference points and wrote those numbers too. Then he went home and let another year pass. In 1986, he dug the holes again. At 8 inches down, he found the first earthworms. He didn't call anyone. He didn't drive to the co-op to let Harlon know. He just crouched there in the dirt for a long moment, looking at what was coming back to life in a place everyone else had written off as finished. Then he stood up, wrote 1.1% in the notebook, and drove home. The Rolex was still on Harlon's wrist, but the ground was already changing. There's a particular kind of courage that nobody writes songs about. Not the courage that charges forward. Not the kind that makes noise or draws a crowd or gives a good quote to the local paper. The kind nobody writes songs about is the courage to do nothing. To hold still when everything in you wants to prove something. To resist the pressure of eyes that are waiting for you to fail. And to trust a process so slow, it's almost invisible. Reuben Klaas had that kind of courage in abundance. And it was about to be tested by the one thing more dangerous than open mockery. Silence. By 1987, the earthworms were at 4 inches. Not a few. Numbers. Reuben wrote it in the notebook alongside the organic matter reading, 1.6%. The topsoil at his 3 reference points had deepened by 2, sometimes 3 millimeters since the year before. That sounds like almost nothing. And if you measured it in a single year, it was almost nothing. But Reuben wasn't measuring in single years. He was measuring in the only unit that actually matters when you're rebuilding soil. Direction, not how far. Which way. Every measurement was moving the right direction. Every spring, the hole told a better story than the spring before. The ground that everyone in Meade County had dismissed in a sentence was doing something that took most farmland generations to do. It was healing itself, one earthworm at a time, 1 millimeter at a time, one quiet season after another. Reuben spent almost nothing. His total costs over 5 years, the purchase price, chainsaw fuel, grass seed, his own labor priced at standard farm wage rates, came to $312 per acre. He had not borrowed a single dollar. He had not bought a single piece of new equipment. He had no operating loan to service, no input costs bleeding him through the winter, no bank officer calling to ask about his projections. What he had was time, and the discipline to use it correctly. Curtis Prawl had been the extension agent for Southwest Kansas for nearly 2 decades, and he was not a man given to strong reactions. He was methodical, even-tempered, the kind of man who trusted data over instinct and wrote careful notes in the margins of soil surveys. He had been the one, back in 1961, to officially classify the Schoenfeld Southwest corner as Class 6 ground, unsuitable for cultivation, recommended use rangeland, or abandoned entirely. He was the one who had written the words dead ground in the margin. He hadn't thought much about that notation in years. The crisis had buried everyone in paperwork, in failed farm assessments, in the grim arithmetic of what could be salvaged and what couldn't. Curtis was not a man who dwelt on old decisions. So when a neighboring farmer mentioned in passing, in the spring of 1988, that Reuben Klaas was getting ready to plant corn on the old Schoenfeld scrap ground, Curtis drove out primarily to satisfy his own curiosity. He expected to find a man making an expensive mistake on ground that had already proved its limits twice. He stood at the field edge and didn't speak for a long time. The color stopped him first, dark where it had been gray. That deep, almost chocolate tone that soil takes on when organic matter is building, when life is present in quantity. The surface had structure to it, a crumb texture that healthy soil creates for itself when it's left alone long enough to organize. The grass waterways Reuben had built in the draws were thick and rooted, holding the banks clean. There were no bare spots, no crust, no erosion scarring. Curtis walked in a few steps and crouched down and pressed his thumb into the surface. It gave the way good soil gives, firm but yielding, with that faint living smell that no amount of fertilizer can fake. He stood up. He looked at Reuben. "How?" he said. Reuben thought about it for a moment. "Didn't do much," he said. "Mostly just stopped." He planted that May. No till, directly into the grass sod he'd spent 4 years building. No commercial fertilizer, no herbicide. Saved seed, his old planter, and soil temperature as his planting signal rather than the calendar date everyone else used. What came up that fall was 127 bushels per acre. The Meade County average that year, on the best ground in the county. Class 1 and Class 2 soils that had been farmed and fertilized and irrigated for generations, was 118. Curtis Prawl wrote it up in his quarterly report and flagged it for follow-up at the state level. Within 2 years, a graduate student from the agronomy department at Kansas State had driven down to spend a full season documenting what Reuben had done. She was young, thorough, and not easily impressed. She had seen yield anomalies before and knew how to explain most of them away. She couldn't explain this one away. Her written assessment used the word anomalous twice in the first paragraph. Her numbers were straightforward. Reuben's per bushel cost of production was $1.43. The county average was $3.20. His return on total invested capital, purchase price, all inputs, all labor, exceeded 600% by any conservative projection she ran. He had paid $140 an acre for ground nobody else would touch. He had spent less to restore it than one monthly payment on one of Harlon Vaoth's four-wheel drive tractors, and it was now outperforming the best natural ground in the county. She drove back to Manhattan and wrote it up and couldn't quite believe the numbers even as she typed them. The ground kept improving. Reuben kept measuring, kept recording. The spiral notebooks accumulated on the shelf in his mudroom. 1, then 2, then 3. Each one a season's worth of data written in the same unhurried hand. His daughter, visiting from Wichita one summer, saw the notebooks and started a proper filing system for him, cross-referencing the soil measurements by reference point and year. Reuben used it without comment, which was the highest praise he gave for most things. He never took an operating loan. He never bought a new tractor. Harlon Vaoth's dealership went into receivership in 1989. The Rolex went with it, sold to cover a fraction of what was owed. Harlon drove a borrowed truck now, and the particular confidence that had made him the voice of every room he walked into had gone quiet inside him, replaced by something more complicated that he hadn't yet found words for. He was not a bad man. He had believed what he sold. But belief, it turns out, is not protection. Not for the believer, and certainly not for the people who trusted him. 110 farms, gone. 40 acres of dead ground, quietly becoming the most productive soil in the county. And Reuben Klaas, crouching beside his field in the October light, pulling an ear of corn from the stalk, feeling the weight of it in his hand the way his father had taught him. Not counting it, just feeling it, and knowing without saying that the distance between what this ground had been and what it was now had been crossed. Not by force, by patience, by restraint, by the willingness to trust something you couldn't see yet and wait for it to arrive. The notebook stood in a row on the mudroom shelf. 9 years of data. 9 years of a ground coming back to life. Outside, the field ran dark, and even to the limestone escarpment, and the last of the evening light lay flat across it, and it looked, if you knew what you were looking at, like something that had been given back. Most reckonings arrive loud. A courtroom, a foreclosure notice tacked to a door, an auctioneer's voice carrying across a yard full of neighbors who can't meet your eyes. The crisis on the plains had delivered plenty of those, public, documented, witnessed by anyone who cared to look. But some reckonings are quiet. They happen at a livestock auction rail on a cold November morning, between two men who don't need an audience for what has to be said. This is the one that mattered. Harlon Vaoth found Reuben at the Mead livestock auction in November of 1990. He looked older than his age in the way that happens when a particular version of yourself collapses and you have to keep living anyway. The Rolex was gone. The truck he arrived in belonged to someone else. The voice that had filled every room he walked into for 15 years had gone somewhere inside him and hadn't come all the way back out. He waited until a pen of feeder calves finished selling. Then he walked over and stood beside Reuben at the rail and looked out at the pen for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you something," Harlon said. Reuben waited. He was good at waiting. "I sold 180 tractors to farmers in this county," Harlon said, "on terms I knew were aggressive. I told them the land would keep going up. I told them the export market was permanent." He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. 110 of those men are gone. Farms gone. Some of them... He stopped again. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both of them knew what some of them had done. "I stood in the co-op and laughed at you," Harlon said. "You were the only man in this county who knew what he was doing, and I laughed at you." The pen was empty now. A gate swung open at the far end with a clang that echoed once and faded. Reuben was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man searching for words. The silence of a man who already has them and is deciding whether they're the right ones. "The ground wasn't the problem, Harlon," he said. "The debt was. It was always. The debt." Harlon nodded. He had nothing to add to that. Some sentences are complete the moment they're spoken, and the only honest response is to receive them. They stood there another minute. Then Harlon put his hands in his pockets and walked back to the borrowed truck, and Reuben turned back to the rail, and that was the end of it. No forgiveness asked for, none offered or withheld. Just two men, and the truth of what had happened, stated plainly, in a livestock barn in Meade County, Kansas, with the smell of hay and animals around them, and the winter coming on. Reuben farmed those 40 acres for 29 more years. He never took an operating loan. He never bought a new tractor. He kept the K-State notebook system his daughter had introduced, measuring the same 3 reference points each spring, adding the numbers to volumes that eventually filled an entire shelf. By the time he was done, the series ran to 9 volumes, 9 spiral notebooks, each one a year's worth of data written in the same steady hand, a record of something coming back to life so gradually that no single entry could show you what was happening. But the full sweep of them together told a story that no agronomist who read them could dismiss. The topsoil at his reference points, which had measured in inches when he started, was 11 inches deep by the time he retired. The organic matter had climbed from 0.8% in 1984 to 4.1%, a number that represented decades of biological work, of earthworms and root systems, and decomposing grass-building layer after invisible layer of something real and lasting. In a good year, it yielded 140 bushels of corn. A soil scientist came out from the University in Manhattan in 2015 and spent 2 days walking the ground with instruments that Reuben didn't fully understand. At the end of the second day, the man stood at the Limestone escarpment and told Reuben, with the particular admiration of someone who has spent a career studying what's possible and rarely sees it achieved, that the soil compared favorably to ground that had never been broken, that what Reuben had done in a single working lifetime on 40 acres that the Extension Office had formally written off was rebuild something approaching native prairie soil from almost nothing. Reuben thanked him, offered him coffee, and didn't say much else. What was there to say? The ground said it. Curtis Prawl retired from the Kansas Extension Service in 2012. On his last day, he went through the old files in his office the way you go through anything you've accumulated over 40 years, slowly, with the particular feeling of a life passing through your hands in paper form. Surveys, yield reports, soil assessments going back to 1971. The documentation of a region's boom and collapse and slow, uneven recovery. Near the bottom of a drawer, he found the original Finney County soil map from 1961. He spread it out on his desk, the county laid out in color-coded patches, dark for the best ground, lighter shades descending through the classifications down to white for the land beyond reclamation. There on the southwest corner of Section 14 was a small white patch, the dead ground. His own notation, written more than 50 years earlier, still legible in the margin in his younger handwriting. He sat there looking at it for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a black marker. He uncapped it, and he colored in that small white patch, filled it in dark as the best Class 1 ground on the map, pressing the marker down until the white was completely gone, and what remained looked like it had always belonged. He recapped the marker. He set it down. In the margin, beside where his old notation had been, he wrote 2 words, Rubens Ground. He left the map on the desk for whoever came next. What do you do with a story like this? You don't turn it into a lesson, because lessons are for classrooms. And this happened in the real world, in the dirt, in the middle of one of the worst agricultural disasters in American history. You don't sand it down into inspiration because the men who lost their farms were not uninspired. They were trapped, and the trap was built by forces larger than any single decision. What you do is hold the truth of it plainly. One man watched what failed. He absorbed it early enough and deeply enough that when the pressure came, when the loan officers sat at kitchen tables across the county and told farmers that leverage was wisdom, he already knew what borrowed money required of you. He had seen his father decline quietly, without drama, and farm the same ground carefully for 30 years and die owing nothing. That inheritance was worth more than any section of land at any price. He bought 40 acres that nobody wanted for $140 an acre. He spent $312 total per acre over 6 years, including his own labor. He asked the ground to do almost nothing for 4 years while he helped it remember what it was. He measured. He waited. He trusted a process he couldn't see and didn't try to force. And the ground came back, not as a miracle, not as luck, as the completely predictable result of patience and restraint applied consistently over time. The 2 qualities that the boom years had made to seem like weakness, like his daddy's boy thinking, like 40 acres of nothing. Harlon Vaoth rebuilt his life modestly after the dealership closed. He sold equipment parts, then worked for a co-op, then retired quietly. He was not a ruined man in the end, just a reduced one. He had believed what he sold. That belief had cost 110 families their farms, and he carried that weight in the particular way that honest men carry things they can't put down and can't undo. Steadily, without drama, until the end. The 9 notebooks sat on a shelf in Reuben's mudroom until his daughter drove down from Wichita and packed them into a box and drove them to the agronomy library at Kansas State, where they were cataloged and preserved as a primary research document. Graduate students still read them. The data holds. The ground itself passed to his daughter, who farms it the same way. No operating loans, no new tractors, the same reference points measured each spring. The numbers still moving in the right direction. 11 inches of topsoil where there had been gray clay and caliche. 4.1% organic matter where there had been almost none. 140 bushels where there had been cedar brush and silence and a crowd of people laughing at a quiet man's raised hand. The map still hangs on the wall of the Finney County Extension Office. The small dark patch in the corner of Section 14 looks like it was always there. It wasn't. Someone made it, one season at a time.